And for everybody's attention tonight, we are actually piloting our translation feature for the Indigenous Liberation Speaker Series. I am speaking very slowly and very intently because we have translators who are doing their best to translate as people are speaking extemporaneously. So I just want everybody to kind of be aware that we are kind of keeping this this rhythm, this cadence, out of courtesy for our translators, Mayra and Jennifer. So we have a few people joining. On the screen, you see the directions for the translation. So in your taskbar for Zoom, you'll have the globe icon. You'll click on that and select your language, and you'll be able to hear this either translated in English, the whole thing, translated in Spanish, the whole thing, or you can select the original audio as well. So. Okay, we have 5 minutes after the hour. So my name, so as is our practice at the North American Indian Center of Boston, we are on the traditional indigenous territory of the Massachusetts Nation, who continue to this day, in part through their lineal descendants, the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog. And acknowledging the land that North American Indian Center is on, we are making agreements with our host tribe, the Pueblo Indígena. One such agreement is to support every effort by the tribe to rematriate land and natural resources back to the original peoples. So I am Jean-Luc Perit. My tribe is the Tunica Biloxi tribe of Louisiana. My grandmother is also a Mississippi band of Choctaw Indians. Tonight I'm actually speaking from my own home territory in Louisiana. So I'm privileged to be near where my ancestors are buried. Of course, we are gathered here tonight because of great urgency. The death toll during the manifestations in Peru in response to the coup that is being led by Dina Boluarte. There are over 60 people that have lost their lives thus far. And so as Indigenous peoples of North America to Indigenous peoples of South America, Eagle and Condor, we say that our fight is one. So it is with that we are, with those intentions that we are coming here tonight. So with that, I'll give the word to Matoyi Monroe.
Thank you, Jean-Luc. Good evening. Buenas noches. My name is Matoyi Monroe, and I am the co-leader of United American Indians of New England. Since the beginning of 2022, part of our educational and agitational work has been to present Indigenous Liberation Series webinars on topics of interest to our Indigenous communities and allies. We're grateful to be able to present a program tonight on the ongoing crisis in Peru, where listeners will be able to get some truthful information about what has been happening there and why. As Jean-Luc mentioned, this is especially important given the propaganda coming from the Boluarte government, as well as from the Biden administration that has endorsed and provided material assistance to the genocidal coup regime there. Our relatives in Peru are on the front lines of the impacts of climate change that they have not caused. Our relatives in Peru are on the front lines of resisting destructive multinational mining projects that steal the land from the people and the wealth from the land. Our Quechua and Aymara relatives in Peru serve as an inspiration to all indigenous peoples because of their centuries of ongoing resistance to colonialism and extraction. And they need our international solidarity now more than ever. So we're pleased to present Sandy Grande, Germani Ojeda Ludena, and Leo Garofalo tonight. Professor Grande is Quechua and a professor of political science and Native American and Indigenous studies at the University of Connecticut. She's the author of Red Pedagogy, Native American Social and Political Thought, a groundbreaking and influential work often used in Indigenous studies as well as other programs. A founding member of New York Stands for Standing Rock, which is a group of scholars and activists that forwarded the aims of Native American and Indigenous sovereignty and resurgence. She is an outstanding example of someone who is both a scholar and an activist. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Marué. It's lovely to be hosted by you. I have to say, it's been a challenge to garner support from Indigenous organizers here in the Global North. In some ways, I feel like there's been a lot of support in other ways, maybe from more academic organizations that will remain unnamed. It's been a challenge, so we really, really appreciate, I mean, you reached out to me to get something organized, and I can't say enough about how much that meant to us and the folks that I work with and organize with here in what is Wangan territory. So thank you very much. To everybody, Ayanchu, Ayintuntas, Fitimi, Sandy Grande, it's a double honor and just lovely to see my colleague, Leo Garofalo here. We're now at different institutions, but I'm very glad to be on this webinar with you and Yermani, who's my Quechua teacher. So I'm sure I got graded later on my pronunciation. Good to see you, Yermani. And also a good comrade in the struggle, Indigenous struggle globally. So they will introduce themselves. I think that's what we decided as I shift to them and their remarks. I think what we'll do is, get a different kinds of background from each of their perspectives. And then maybe we can even go 2 rounds so we can be in a bit of dialogue with each other. And then at the end, given my interest in sort of pedagogy, as Marué suggested, I'd love to think about, to make sure that we save time to think not just about the context and what's happening, but also how do we move from, I think it's a question for all global Indigenous struggles, right? How do we move from moments of crisis and movements into maybe longer lasting change? And to me, in part, that's a pedagogical project. And what I mean by that isn't something necessarily that's tied to school institutions or things like that, but how we think about teaching each other and learning from each other in a way that's sustainable. So that's what I mean by a pedagogical project. So I'll start with just some of the basics. I think Jean-Luc, you talked about the number of peoples that have been killed. The current crisis in Peru, there's been quite a few like other, I guess, colonialist entities. But the current, I would say, like official narrative is that this current crisis started on December 7th with the event of President Castillo's removal, his attempt at I guess what's being called a legislative coup to dissolve Congress and implement a state of emergency. He was arrested, he remains under arrest, and his actions are being called, as part of a failed coup. Castillo was the fifth president, I believe, in as many years in Peru. So the instability, this kind of instability, the highest levels of the administration is not uncommon. Dilma Boluarte is, his vice president is now serving as the president. She's been very busy, I think, building her base, very much capitulating to what we would think about here as the right. She has the support of the military, and certainly of the United States, as Madeline intimated. So as a result of these events, there's been widespread protests across the country, starting in the southern region, specifically in Puno and Cusco, where there was also, that was sort of the widest support for Castillo, for him to be elected. It since, has another, center for the violence is now in Lima. It's sort of spreading from the south to Lima. And in these protests, there's been severe violent repression against the protesters. There's some evidence that it's now closer to over 70 people that have been killed by police and through state violence, most of them Quechua and Aymara indigenous peoples, including very young children. In fact, I saw like the whole list that seems to be like it's being crowdsourced a bit from on the ground. And there's, there's many young people that have been killed, and that's equally, that's just devastating. So we're here to talk about this situation, and again, by the invitation of Madeline and the United American Indians of New England organization. And I think the other thing that I'll say before I kind of kick us off is something as we've been working here and organizing here that we've been really committed to is, there's been, I think, other podcasts and webinars, and I'm more familiar with I think the more common framing is this is being cast as sort of a failure of democracy, or failure of the Peruvian state, or failure of the left, or failure of the right, or it's been pro or anti-Castillo, or and those I think are all really interesting and important questions and concerns. But I think what we aim to highlight here is the sort of longer durée of colonialism. This didn't start on December 7th, and the impact of indigenous peoples on Peru and the ongoing human rights violations and state violence that have been acted against the Quechua, Aymara, and other indigenous peoples in Peru for centuries. So with that, Yermani, I'm gonna start with you, and if you could introduce yourself and then offer us from your perspective, your sense of the events since December 7th, but also I know you'll probably share a broader context.
Hello, Dr. Sandra, thank you very much. Matowin, thank you for inviting me. And thank you all the people who is present, listening us, talking about what is going on in Peru. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Germani Ojeda Dudena. I am a Quechua, part of a Quechua community in the region of Apurimac. Apurimac is in the southern Andes of Peru. In Apurimac started the protests immediately after Dina Boluarte took the power as the new president of Peru. in Apurímac started the protest in the town of Andahuaylas, and in one day of protest, the two Quechua people have been killed. It was December the 8th, and the second day, December the 9th, similarly, other five people have been killed by police forces in Andahuaylas. Then immediately the protests spread around another Andean regions, mainly Cusco, Ayacucho, Puno, Junín, Arequipa. These regions are the historical land territory of Quechuas. In Puno, Quechuas and Aymaras, but in the other regions, mainly Quechua people. Before starting this presentation, I would like to share some words that a Quechua woman, Aida Aroni, shared during the protests in Lima. Aida, a Quechua woman from Ayacucho region in Peru, was participating in the protests, and police forces detained Aida, and she was for 2 days in the police station in Lima. And she's a Quechua woman who said in an interview that in Quechua language, we name this Mistis, this non-Quechua people, these governants, are killing indigenous people, not only during the protests, but in the history of Peru. Not only during this protest, this history for Quechuas, I mean this kind of elimination, body elimination is not only during this protest, it is part of the history of what we name as Peru. And to understand it, to understand the words of Aida Aroni, we have to understand the two Perus. The official Peru and the other Peru. In Peru, we name the other Peru as Peru Profundo, or many other people from Lima say that it is the interior del Peru, the interior of Peru, implying that Lima could be the exterior of Peru. But that Peru Profundo, the other Peru, is mainly the indigenous Peru, with majority of Quechua population. That separation between two Perus is not new. Also during Spanish colonization, there was a separation between República de Indios, that is the Peru Profundo, and the other republic, República de los Criollos o Mistis. It didn't change. It has not changed during the history until now. And just to understand how Quechuas and other indigenous people has suffered in Peru, we have to acknowledge that when Peru was created in 1821, in the 19th century, the indigenous, or the other Peru, the Peru Profundo, was the majority of people living in the territory of Peru. The majority. Now, according to official information, Peruvian government information, indigenous people are around 25%, and Quechua speakers around 14%. We can see what happened during these centuries of Peru to make that the majority of population now is becoming a minority, with more and more mestizo people and less indigenous people. It shows what for many people, it's difficult to say that in Latin America we don't have settlers. But what is happening is that we have, as a scholar, Shannon Spitz says, nation-state settlers in Latin America, especially in the case of Peru, for example. The settlers are the nation-states and the nation-state governments who are removing indigenous people. In the case of Peru, for example, is by creating what is the ideology of Peruvianism in order to reduce the participation and the presence and to eliminate indigeneity. For example, it happens with the use of Spanish language as the official language. Even in the territories of Quechua people, where the majority of speakers are, or the majority of people are Quechua speakers, like Apurimac region, my home region, almost the 80% of people are native speakers of Quechua, but the official language is Spanish, part of that project of Peruvianism, to assimilate indigenous people, to make them Peruvians, but not indigenous. Or the other more contemporary project of multiculturalism. It happens when the Peruvian government named indigenous people as pueblos originarios, not contemporary people. Yes, pueblos originarios, as people from the past, people who doesn't change, essentializing, exoticizing indigenous people, or just showing us the richness of the diversity of Peru, the richness for tourism, the richness to show to the world to visit Peru, but not as citizens, not as part of Peru. To understand Quechuas as Peruvians, because Quechuas, we feel, and we are Peruvians. We are Quechuas and Peruvians. That is our identification. Just to understand Quechuas and Peruvians, I want to mention that I am the second generation of Quechuas who are citizens. I mean citizens with the right to vote in electoral processes in Peru. My grandparents didn't have the opportunity to have the Peruvian ID. My parents, for the first time, they had the opportunity to have the Peruvian ID, being the first generation. I am the second generation. Peru is celebrating 200th or bicentenario of its creation as a nation state. And Quechuas are we are the second generation of Quechuas being part of that, what is Peru. It started after the agrarian reform, when Quechuas and comunidades campesinas have been created, and they had access, as now have access to lands. Before that, Quechuas, I mean before 1970, Quechuas were part as property of hacendados, or huge land owners. Before 1970s, we were not considered people. We were considered servants and property of hacendados. Hacendados were mainly Misti people. Who are Misti people? Mistis are non-Quechuas, mestizos or white people. We Quechuas name them as Misti because they are not Quechuas, and they, in our history as Quechuas, have the political control, the political power of what is Peru. In this context, happened for the first time that a rural teacher, school teacher, Pedro Castillo, has been elected as president in 2021 with the support of Quechua people and other indigenous communities mainly. in a political campaign, as always in Peru, with racism against indigenous people participating in this process. Pedro Castillo was the favorite to win especially in Quechua territories, but mainstream media that has an important role in this political crisis in Peru, they didn't show that Pedro Castillo was in the first position in the political polls. They show traditional Misti people from Lima every day, giving them spaces in media interviews. I mean, in media outlets like television, newspapers, and radio stations. 1 week before the election, they couldn't hide anymore the presence of Pedro Castillo as the favorite. 1 week before the election, they had to show the official poll where Pedro Castillo was in the first position in the political polls for the presidency of Peru. Immediately, when Pedro Castillo won the presidency, they started trying to Mistis annulate the elections completely. They didn't recognize that Pedro Castillo could be the president of Peru. They started a campaign of racism. That is the best description, racism. They didn't accept a rural school teacher to be the president. Even when Castillo doesn't self-identify as indigenous, but that is a part also of a process of Peru of assimilation. Many indigenous people prefer to say that they are mestizos instead being indigenous. It is in order to avoid discrimination. It's in order to avoid being excluded in Peru. It's easy for many indigenous people, for example, like the case of Pedro Castillo, to say, I am campesino or mestizo, but not indigenous. Another important thing during this crisis is the role of Fujimorismo, a political party founded by the dictator Alberto Fujimori, that still now Fujimorismo has a lot of power and thousands of people as supporters of Fujimorismo. They now are in power with Dina Boluarte. Dina Boluarte, who has elected as vice president of Pedro Castillo with the support of a leftist party, Peru Libre, now is in power in alliance with Fujimorismo. That is one thing that indigenous people, supporters of Pedro Castillo, don't accept, that Dina Boluarte has elected with a leftist party and now is completely in the opposite side of a leftist party, is in alliance with Fujimorismo in the power of Peru. For the future, I would like to say that this crisis will continue. This will not end. It will not finish this protest, this crisis, because for Quechuas and for indigenous people, we need changes in Peru. We don't need and we feel now during this protest that some reforms will change and people will say, yeah, we will finish this protest. No. We are demanding big changes in Peru. And among those big changes is that the role of indigenous people as being part of Peru, mainly in the political power of Peru, to be considered as citizens, to be considered with the same rights as Mistis, with the same rights as, for example, people from Lima. This crisis will continue. In regions like Cusco, and Puno, and Apurímac, people are still organizing to continue in the protest. In Puno region, the protest is still in process. Puno, as a region of Quechuas and Aymaras, is completely closed. Some provinces of Cusco are also closet completely, with people protesting. The main demand is now the resignation of Dina Boluarte as the president of Peru, the dissolution of the Peruvian parliament, and also the creation of a new Peruvian constitution. Those are the main demands of indigenous people, who mainly now indigenous people are protesting. Maybe Quechua and Aymara people are protesting, and as I mentioned, this protest, this crisis will continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hermani, for that important context and history, and really grounding this conversation, you know, in a good way. Leo, I know you were there when it all came down. So I imagine you have some reflections around that time, but also, you know, as a historian, you've been thinking and being a good comrade to all of us for such a long time. So I'm excited to hear your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Sandy, and thank you everybody who's organized this wonderful event, which is obviously part of a longer set of series. And I think that's so important to have this kind of dialogue. I'm a professor of Latin American history at a small liberal arts college called Connecticut College, just down the river, closer to the coast from where Sandy and some of my colleagues are. And I've been in Peru, as Sandy mentioned, since August last year. With a couple of visits home to Connecticut, researching Cusco's colonial Afro-Andean history, so a minority population of the African diaspora here in Cusco and its regions. I've been working mainly in the archives in Lima and in Cusco, where I'm currently living and continuing to work. So a couple of things, 2 points maybe, just to help keep the conversation going and to build on the wonderful introduction that Sandy provided. And Giovanni's, I think, you know, spot on, really helpful understanding of how this is indeed, for many people, an indigenous issue and an indigenous struggle, right? There's kind of another framework too, and I'll bring some of that forward. So 2 points to make. One is the historical reality to keep in mind, both for this case and in similar struggles and crises around social movements clashing with central governments, armed forces playing sort of pivotal roles, international actors like the United States or China or others with investments and deep interests in energy resources and mining resources in particular. When we talk about the Andes, when we talk about Peru, it's not homogeneous, right? The indigenous population isn't homogeneous. The urban population is a majority urban country now is also not, you know, homogeneous. We have kind of weak political parties that kind of come and go. There's a lot of personal sort of appeal of certain candidates, right? So a certain candidate will come in for a time. And so this leads to a lot of continuity and very little change, right? So I definitely agree with that idea that as successful and as powerful and as persuasive as these protests have been, this is part of an ongoing process. So my first point is that the Andes, Peru, other Andean countries like Bolivia, Ecuador, and Colombia are also very complex. And we really have to understand those shifting coalitions and different groups that are coming together around these protests. And I think that's something that's also similar among all of these Andean republics is that, you know, they very much have a neoliberal economic model which favors exports of natural resources, energy resources like oil and natural gas. Cusco is a big producer of natural gas, for instance, and yet it has to go to the coast to be processed and put into containers to be sent back here for people to use for cooking and heating and things of that sort, right? So it's also very centralized governments, very centralized power, very centralized economies as well. And that tends to work well with nested elites who have connections to these multinational firms and corporations that are bringing capital in. And often these are Latin American capitalist coalitions, Brazilian road builders and construction companies, Chilean airlines and supermarkets and so forth, right? So it's not just people from the global north, so to speak, coming and exploiting the global south, right? So a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of differences. So we really, all of us, including me, right? I'm a colonialist. I research and work on the 16th and 17th century, but I'm kind of, along with other folks here, kind of living this reality and trying to understand it. So events like this are really helpful because we have to dig down below the headlines and below even some of the analysis that's offered, particularly by governments, right? Which are going to have vested interest. So if we go back further in time, we look at like Tawantinsuyo, right? The Inca Empire. It was something that was negotiated on a regional level, right? So there were different coalitions, different groups of indigenous peoples, right? There were many, many dozens of indigenous languages spoken in the Andes. It wasn't just Quechua, that was an imperial language, right? But it was also an ethnic and a local language for some groups that helped build the Inca Empire, but other groups got incorporated. So it was a multi-ethnic empire, right? With nested coalitions to make it survive and to move forward. And Spanish colonialism was very much the same way, right? The Spanish, small group of invaders with West and Central African people and enslaved indigenous people from Nicaragua and the Caribbean coming into the Andes also had to not just fight, but also had to negotiate and make compromises, right? So when we think of sort of the Spanish Empire, we're thinking about different colonialisms which work in different ways with different configurations of power. And in those coalitions of power are indigenous people as well, right? Factions of the Inca Empire, which saw the Spanish as an opportunity to move their particular lineage forward. Other indigenous groups, the Cañades, the Chachapoya, others who wanted to end the Inca Empire and its hegemony, right? And this was an opportunity to do this, right? So when we even think about the Spanish invasion, we need to think about it as, is it a Spanish invasion with indigenous allies, or is it an indigenous rebellion with Spanish allies, right? At least initially, right? And then you have these outsiders beginning to create the kind of dynamics in which they take over most of the political power, most of the land, and most of the resources, and they create the dynamics of racism and exclusion, right? That we've just been hearing about, right? So this is all happening in the pre-Columbian period. It's happening in the colonial period leading up to the republics, right? The independence, these modern republics, which are like our republic in the United States, divided into an executive, legislative, and a judicial branch, right? And those branches will compete with each other. And sometimes one will overthrow the other, right? And we're seeing an example of that, right? So that's some background, right? Think about complexity, try to avoid simplistic answers, right? Dig below anything that looks like it's homogeneous and really try to figure it out, right? The other thing that I would suggest that we want to think about, the second point that I want to make is that we're really witnessing the most recent manifestation of a political impasse that has repeatedly led to political crises. That's why, as Sandy was saying, we've seen 5 presidents in as many years. That this goes back to Fujimorismo, right? To an outsider president, right? In his time, he was the outsider president that the economic and the political elite, were skeptical about, right? He was the person that people turned to as an alternative to the established parties, to the Lima-centered politicians, and also a neoliberal economic model that was being promoted at that particular time. It was an election in 1990, right? So this political crisis kind of goes back to many of those sorts of dynamics. In 1990, Alberto Fujimori is elected, and in many ways as the lesser of two evils, the alternative to Mario Vargas Llosa, the established Limeño, centered anyway, right-wing approach, right, to governing the country. People, the majority of the people who voted said no to that, right, and elected this sort of political unknown, this outsider, who then turned around and implemented the same economic policies in the neoliberal model that we have today. And he carried out a self-coup, right? He had the same sort of problem we see in the US, right? With the Congress divided, unable to do anything, president struggling with that, right? We see him with Castillo, right? Struggling with the Congress that doesn't want to carry out the reforms to the Constitution, decentralization, making greater access for education, things like that, right? So what Alberto Fujimori does in April of 1992, 2 years into his presidency, is with the support of the military, he overthrows the Congress, right? So he shuts down the Congress, he suspends the Constitution, he outlaws all the political parties, and he shuts down the judiciary branch as well, and says anybody that wants to have a political party has to start over again. We're going to write a new constitution. And then he's able to, with this sort of soft authoritarianism and populist policies, such as giving money to the teachers, and winning over the teachers unions to just, in the year before an election, so he get reelected, continuing to argue that, he can be reelected. In Peru, you're not supposed to be able to be reelected, and he was able to finesse it so that he was, through fraud and these other strategies, right, to be in power. But also negotiating with different groups, negotiating with the rural countryside. He had a lot of support from the rural countryside. I wouldn't be surprised if Castillo's teachers union supported him and voted for him in some elections, right? These are the kinds of strange bedfellows that are made when people are negotiating with centralized power and trying to get what they can within a system which is trying to exclude most people, right? And exploit them. So there's some interesting similarities between Alberto Fujimori as an outsider and Castillo as an outsider, right? Presidents who want to do something different, who see the established parties and the Congress as kind of an obstacle for that. In this particular case, Castillo called on the military to support him to overthrow the Congress. The military didn't. They sat on their hands, and the Congress impeached him and had him arrested, right? And now we have, right, people coming forward with legitimate complaints and protests and so forth, rural people and urban people coming together, right, around this, often people with different, very, some general goals which are shared, and then there's lots of particular interests which are sometimes in contradiction, right? And I think that that's one of the things to think about, right? This is an indigenous, right, involved and inspired in many ways, and many of the people that are taking many of those, suffering the losses of the people who are killed in protests are indigenous. There's lots of other people in there as well that are involved in these protests. The system is failing a lot of people, right? And it's a question of whether this neoliberal economic system and the centralized political model can be changed, can be modified, right? Is it possible to reform something which is so exclusive and so exploitative? Is it possible to actually use the established electoral process, right, to create the kind of transformation that's needed? Throughout Latin America in the last 20 years, these so-called governments of the left, whether it's Lula in Brazil, or Evo Morales in Bolivia, or Rafael Correa in Ecuador, basically what they've done is continue the neoliberal economic model, which is so destructive of the environment, so destructive of water, so destructive of life, right? So completely not sustainable. They simply use the government revenue for that to plow into more social welfare programs, which are definitely needed, but they haven't changed the model, right? And I think Castillo was very much locked in that same box. There was no other alternative to continuing this model, right? I'd also agree that, he's not an indigenous person, right? He doesn't identify. He sees himself as coming from a campesino, right? A farming kind of background, a rural background, a school teacher, a union leader. Certainly somebody who was part of that northern highland region around Cajamarca, those areas, which for a long time have not considered themselves to be indigenous. They don't speak Quechua, they don't speak other indigenous languages, they don't necessarily identify as being parts of these indigenous communities. In fact, the first president, supposedly, who was indigenous, right, self-identified as indigenous, but also did not come from an active, or was not an active member of an indigenous community, was President Toledo. And Toledo came in 2000, right, was the person who replaced Alberto Fujimori. And certainly President Humala was also another outsider, right? So when the AP or New York Times says, it's an indigenous president, right, or the only outsider, or the first outsider president, that's not true, right? But it also points to the fact that Peruvians have been trying to use the electoral system, and these candidates who are outside the Lima Circle, outside those people who are connected to multinational companies and interests, to try to change the system. And it's been, people have been really struggling hard for that for a long time. But a lot of these candidates who are elected are not actually capable of creating the kinds of coalitions to create a real transformation, right? Castillo made a lot of promises, and the same people who are organized now that are saying, free our president, we're also mobilizing, at least in the Cusco area, we're mobilizing to put pressure on him to actually fulfill his electoral promises, to reform the Constitution, to change access to education, to do a lot of these sorts of things. Things that he probably was not capable of doing, given the political structure of the country and the political impasse. So those are some of the things that I would encourage people to think about, right? That this is an ongoing crisis, a reoccurrence of some of the same kind of groups, clashing, and also that it's complicated. So you've got to kind of figure it out what's happening in each sort of place. We have to do our homework. We all have to do our homework. I'm trying to come to events like this so I can try to understand it better too.
Thank you for that, Leo. There's no question that the situation is complex. I think we could look at the history of indigeneity here in the global north, particularly where we are. You know, when at the height of invasion, in many ways, we used to teach at Ground Zero, where the Mystic Massacre happened. And so, but I guess I wouldn't want to forsake, you know, the tremendous power dynamic and power of coloniality for this notion of complexity. So I think I push back against that a little bit, you know. So there was, you know, Pequot and Mohegan allies with the French. I wish I could remember this quote from Glenn Couthard, where it's like, any compromise made under threat of your life is really is not the same as, you know, people are just trying to live. And I think there's a similar situation with indigenous struggles in Peru, and similarly with the outcomes with Castillo and Fujimori. There's some things that might look the same when you're struggling against power, but they're very different men and peoples. I would at least argue that. You know, the regime, the authoritarian regime under Fujimori is something that still lives with Peru in so many ways. It's at the crux of how indigenous peoples, who again were sort of narrated as being complicit, as still terrorists. So, you know, they talk about indigenous peoples, particularly in the southern region, as Turico, or terrorists, just like they do here under certain circumstances. You know, maybe the last time we saw that was at Standing Rock, where, you know, there's always already an enemy of the state. So I guess I would just want to overlay that into a lot of the other good information you provided. It is complex, and Peru is maybe, you know, in so many ways, because there's something about, I think, colonialism and capitalism is itself, I think, unsustainable. And when you try to negotiate in a rotten system, which kind of raises, I think, some of the thoughts that Yermani had, in terms of it's just going to be ongoing. And I think, so one of the things, like once we get to it, I think that I would want us to talk about is, I do think, you know, issues like representation and inclusion and reform of the Constitution, all the things that are being demanded right now, is probably a floor of something. It's a very, you know, there are some similarities to the histories here with indigenous peoples, you know, supposedly earning or maybe having imposed citizenship on them in the 1940s. But there's a way in which that also functions as erosion of sovereignty. So I think there's lots of ways in which it's complicated, Leo. So I'm glad you introduced that. I don't know. I think before, and I can certainly talk about, I was going to talk a little bit about like the hand of US imperialism, although there is complicity, I think, because there's global national corporations are precisely that. They have their interests that are almost outside of the state, and they have interest in Chile and, you know, Argentina and Nicaragua and, you know, Australia and the US. And so I think there's a real tension between nation states and complicity between nation states and the global national corporations. So I'll just talk a little bit about that, but I also want to return to, you know, Yermani. I mean, Leo, you were there, and I continue to be there. Yermani, you talked about how there's some closures from the blockades and be up. And so I wonder if you both could talk a little bit too about not just, you know, there's a way in which the killings and the protests are very spectacularized, but there's also just the ongoing people just trying to live, like what's happening to food prices, what's happening to access to, you know, people being able to maintain their sources of income coming in, what little that might be, because there are, you know, the impact of the instability. So I would like to hear from both of you about that. But I just want to say one thing about kind of the US interest in that. because Leo, I think you mentioned sort of resources, but you know, there's been, one of the demands has been to call for elections this year, and they've already made it clear, the Bouarte has already made it clear that that's not happening until maybe early 2024. And that's just not a random date. You know, will be the time, like Peru's natural resources are up for review now, whether it's gas or gold or mining. And they want to make sure, I think, that there's no move to go back to natural, or to have a nationalization of those resources. They want to maintain kind of this control so that the neoliberal kind of structure can be maintained, that US interest can be maintained, that corporate interest can be maintained. So that I think part of that motivation is to make sure that there isn't a return or that the access to resources remains privatized. The only other thing I'll mention, I think right now about kind of US intervention is, it is, you know, there are other nation states, but the US is the US in the world. And it has all the power, whether it's real or imagined or fantasized, that it has. The current Peruvian ambassador is a former CIA agent, you know, and just, I think a couple of weeks after the coup, there was a major I think it was $8 million grant given to the Bouarte government, ostensibly for drug trafficking. But I think that's clearly going to be used for security forces, for policing and surveillance. So there is a real interest, I think, of the US state, its ongoing kind of imperialism around the globe, to make sure that control is maintained and power is maintained, primarily to secure the interests of capital. So I just wanted to mention those two things. But Yermani, I'll go back to you in terms of, and then Leo, what you're seeing or hearing about in terms of the other kinds of impacts, the less spectacular impact. Just because you're not being killed or shot at doesn't mean you're not feeling the impact of the instability. So I wonder if either of you have thoughts to share about that.
We can go. For example, in the case of impacts, of course, the last crisis has deeply affected the life of people living in the Andes, of indigenous people. First, with the pandemic, families, especially children, education have been deeply affected. In my hometown, we stopped the in-person classes immediately after the start of the pandemic, and we continue with the education using radio stations or WhatsApp in some cases during 2 years. Yes, and 2022 was the first year after the pandemic when students returned to primary and secondary schools. And immediately after the attempt to coup of Castillo and the take of power of Dina Boluarte, the teachers union in Peru decided immediately to support Castillo, and they closed completely the schools. Our educational system, educational year starts in March and it ends on December. We remember that this protest started on December the 7th, the 8th. Immediately, schools were closed completely. They didn't close as usual the academic year. For example, in final exams. In my hometown and my home region, they didn't have these final exams. The second thing is that this closure of regions or cities are affecting, especially with the provisions of basic needs for people. Peru is a country where we have a huge gas resource in the region of Cusco, but we don't have in our homes. We have to buy propane gas for to use in our houses for some days or a month, and then buy again, and this is of course a basic need now in our hometowns, and they are very expensive. Before this protest, it cost around 60 soles, that is maybe $15. Now it costs around 150 soles, 200 soles, that is around $50 or $40, and people cannot work. Many members of my family, my relatives, are not working because in Peru, as in other Latin American countries, our economy is mainly, economists name it as informal. We don't have a monthly payment. In the case of indigenous people, more than 80% of indigenous people work every day to gain some money. And now we cannot work, our families cannot work, especially in Cusco, Puno, Apurímac, Ayacucho, in these regions. This is affecting, of course, and it's also creating an opposition in the people, opposition to this protest against government. And since some regions, some towns, for example, in Cusco, Puno, they don't affect directly the economy of Lima, the national government is not doing anything to stop protests. It's not doing anything to stop protests. For example, I would like to talk about a town in Cusco. It's Sicuani, Canchis, that is completely closed. Canchis doesn't have any police to put order in the city. It is completely closed. People are not working almost 2 months or more than 2 months. They cannot work. They decided to close completely, but it is affecting poor families. It is affecting families who live every day. Cusco, who lives mainly by tourism. In Cusco, we opened Machu Picchu, we opened it 3 days ago for tourists. Machu Picchu is the main source of income for thousands of Cuscanians. It is affecting, of course. Besides that is the inflation. After the pandemic, now with this crisis, it will affect mainly indigenous people, mainly poor families.
Thank you, Imani. And Leo, you're there. So maybe like the impact of everyday life.
Absolutely, right. Well, going to the market, right? Half the stalls where you buy fresh fruits and vegetables or meat and fish and chicken and so forth are closed because people can't get the supplies. The market sellers can't get the carrots and the tomatoes and the other things and the fruits and so forth from the rural growers, right, and the suppliers, because roads are blockaded, because transportation links have broken down, right? So you both have producers with products they can't get to market, transportationists who can't do their job, right, and market sellers who aren't able to open up because they don't have anything to sell, right, or what they have to sell has now spoiled, right? So the stalls that are open are struggling with prices going up at a time when, as Imani has pointed out, a lot of people, particularly in Cusco, where tourism is down 80 to 90% from what it normally is. A lot of people are in some ways part of that tourist income circuit, right? There's a lot of mining in this area, but that money doesn't really stay locally. That goes to Lima, that gets exported and so forth. So the motor of this economy here really is producing for the local markets, consumption, services, and of course, tourism, right? But people don't have money to spend in the markets at the same time that the market prices are going up, right? And it's also affecting transportation, right? So gas is now, and we're talking about gasoline here, right? This is a natural gas producing region, but very few of the cars and very few of the other kinds of energy, consuming kinds of establishments and transportation and so forth. They don't run on natural gas; they run on gasoline, right? Which has to be brought from refineries on the coast and so forth, right? So those prices have gone, through the roof, right? They're, twice or three times what they used to be, right? So that, of course, affects everybody, right? Because then also those few products that do make it to market have to spend more for the transportation. People that have to get around have to spend more. So it's creating a deep and kind of scary inflationary cycle for a lot of people here, particularly older people who have lived through hyperinflation in the past. I think that's very, very troubling. And again, I think part of it is we don't really see, well, we're just going to get through the end of this month and then there's going to be a resolution, right? There's going to be good faith efforts on the part of the Congress and the president and protesters to like come up with a solution, right? It doesn't look like that. So it's hard to see what the end in sight is, right? Oftentimes the police, are here trying to stop protests, trying to open up, roads, intersections, things of that sort. Other times they shine in their absence, right? Which is certainly welcome when you don't want to get hit by a stray bullet or a bullet that's aimed at you, right? Or a tear gas canister. But then on the other hand, then you've got, citizens coming out wanting to clear the blockades on a road to let transportation through, protesters circling back around, and then you end up with these street fights, right? Among citizens on different sides of whether or not you should have a road blockade there, and that of course is a failure of the state, right? To one, find a solution, two, mediate conflicts, right? So that they don't become these kinds of things. And I think that that's part of also, what's happening here. This is very much kind of an urban perspective, right? The university before the impeachment of Castillo and his arrest, at the behest of the Congress, the state university here, which houses one of the archives, which is run by the regional government here, but it's in the state university campus. The professors were on strike for a little over a week. And so they locked all the gates and so forth. And then the students, after that strike, asking for higher salaries, right? As part of a national protest. Kind of hard when your central government is unable to resolve problems. They're certainly not looking at salary issues, right? And the need to invest in higher education. The students then were inspired to carry out their own protests. Among other things, they didn't want the same group of professors running the university as they have been for 10 years or more now. They wanted more equal investment, right, in different disciplines, not just the ones that like engineering that are very profitable afterwards. And so they were they locked the gates too for about 3 days, right? But it wasn't until students and other protesters started holding rallies on campuses, because campuses in Peru, as in most of Latin America, are places where the police and the armed forces aren't supposed to go, and that helps protect, right, the freedom of speech, and they become important centers then for debate and discussion and finding solutions, right? So the campus authorities, in their wisdom, if you will, I don't know, decided they didn't want those political speeches to be there, and so they then moved, and this is in the fall, they moved all classes online for the remainder of the semester, which is something that students definitely don't like. They prefer to have classes in person. A lot of the professors here, however, do prefer having classes, online. Easier to arrange in their lives. They don't have to deal with the transportation. So there's sort of lots of different groups that are trying to get some things resolved, right? And so this is kind of happening in the context in which street protests, right, are rallying, and people, the manifestations here kind of follow a certain routine. People rally on the Avenida de la Cultura, which goes by the university and eventually leads into the center, the symbolic center and the political center of the city here in Cusco, right? So those are some of the kinds of things you notice on a daily basis when there are general strikes and roads, intersections are blockaded, and then also transportation companies, the minibuses and the buses that provide urban transportation, when they decide to join those strikes, then everything kind of closes down, right? Because nobody can get anywhere unless you can walk. And so that happens, usually once a week or so. But it's hard because, who are the hardest hit people? The same people who have to protest, right? It's not, the vice president. It's not the congressional, members. It's not the political and economic elite. you know, in Lima, or even they've got their allies here too in Cusco, right? It's not like they're just all concentrated on the coast, right? There are a lot of people here who like the status quo just as it is, right? And those folks aren't hit hard by these things, right? So it's really hard because, you know, the only way you can protest is by blockading highways, by, you know, interrupting these things, but then also hurt you and hurt your family, and, you know, and of course, not resolving that serves the interest of those who don't want to change the status quo, right? Because the longer it goes on, then the more the general public begins to become hostile towards the road blockades, the scarcity in the markets, and feel like, okay, there has to be some solution. And that's very scary, right? Because that's when you have military coups. That's when you have like the population going to get softened up for sort of authoritarian measures coming in.
Mhm. Yeah, and as you said, the targets for that violence will definitely not be the elites. I think it's also important to mention that all of this is coming after the whole COVID pandemic, and which hit obviously Peru also very hard, just like everywhere else. So it's devastation, I think, is being compounded. I do want to move to maybe the last question, and I know there's questions coming in, and we definitely need to turn to those. And some people are asking, like, what can we do? And definitely want to make sure that we get to that. So, Leo, you sort of hinted that, you know, Boluarte has called for, I think she said, a multi-party dialogue, but I guess, you know, given what everybody's saying, I think it's, you know, how do you engage in dialogue without accountability for the, you know, just the most recent murders, or democratic processes without representation, or recognition of the ongoing disavowal, the centuries of disavowal of Indigenous repression and disenfranchisement. It's hard to just then come around the table, which I agree seems to start to set up a really troubling, another kind of storm of violence, I think, that will clearly be enacted against, I think, Indigenous bodies. And already, I think it was reported in the Guardian. I didn't see it reported anywhere else. But there's already things starting, like trying to pass a bill into law that would strip the uncontacted Indigenous. We haven't talked about the Indigenous peoples of the Amazonian region, but to strip them of whatever protections they have, and dismantling the existing reserves that I think would modify an earlier law, and it was early in the early 2000s. You know, and that's being launched by lawmakers from Fuerza Popular, which is the party of Keiko Fujimori. And again, I think it's clearly about access for the business class, for the elite class, to resources. So backed by the region, it's trying to give the power back to make reserves to the regional governments. That would then open up timber, oil, whatever. And the claim continues to be, well, two things. I think that that these Indigenous peoples don't even exist. There's been sort of a campaign launched around denying their existence. And then secondly, to also claim that they just stand in the way of development. Which again, I think sounds familiar to probably Indigenous peoples here, of always being in the way of progress, of development, of profit. So just if you would each maybe stay, and then I'll also offer, and then we'll turn to the questions of, we're clearly in for a long haul, but if there's a way out or a way forward, or like what, just some concrete, you know, if you have them, thoughts about what might be some of those first steps, or what might be, you know, how we could bring some of this to a different place. Money?
Yeah, I think one thing that could change and help to go out from this situation is electoral process. Maybe for this year, that is the main demand of the protest. They are tired with politicians. They are tired mainly with the Peruvian parliament, with the Congress. I think that thing could calm this situation and move to another maybe situation to create spaces to talk about how to solve this problem. And currently, we don't have that is another crisis. We don't have institutionalized parties, political parties, to canalize these demands. We don't have the traditional political parties, mainly in Quechua regions, indigenous people, they don't have presence. In the history of Peru, the big political parties are from Lima, mainly political parties created by Misti people, by Criollo, Misti people. And Quechuas and indigenous, historically, they were not part of these political parties. Until now, these political parties don't include indigenous people. They just need indigenous during the electoral process. Of course, they are present during the electoral process in different towns around Peru, but after that, they don't include indigenous people. I think after, and if the government decide to call for a new election during this year, the next debate must be about reforms or a new constitution. That will be the next debate in Peru. There is a question if it will change or not the historical situation of indigenous people. I think I would like to say that not necessarily a new constitution will change. No, I think this, as I mentioned, this crisis is not new, that we can change easily writing a new constitution. No, I think that in order to avoid this kind of crisis, we need to create a consensus in Peru that accepts everyone as Peruvians, especially to indigenous people. I understand for the future the necessity to include indigenous people in what is Peru, in the political decision mainly. If we review the history, for example, of the Peruvian Congress, the Peruvian Parliament, we don't have any indigenous as the president of the Congress. We don't have. If we review similarly the CONFIEP, the organization of companies in Peru, we don't have any indigenous in the history of this organization, and not an indigenous also in the directory of this institution. Leo was mentioning about Alejandro Toledo, self-identified as indigenous president, but also Pedro Castillo could be identified as indigenous, but it doesn't mean that the indigenous people was present governing Peru, taking power of Peru. It doesn't mean necessarily. And for that reason, I think for the future, after this, maybe this year or next year could be an electoral process, we need to debate, to think about this. And as an indigenous person, I hope for the future the emergence of a political party or an indigenous movement in Peru. That is one thing that we need in Peru. As an indigenous person. I know that neighboring countries like Ecuador, Bolivia, they have indigenous movements and indigenous political parties, but in Peru we don't have. One reason is that always Lima as the center of power and economy in Peru has also these political parties. But we need for the future a strong indigenous movement or a strong political party, including or lead by indigenous people. I think that could be the future, but it will not necessarily change and will make Peru a society without colonialism. No, I don't think so. The colonial Peru is everywhere in Peru. As I mentioned, in the use of the language. As I mentioned, this country doesn't include indigenous people. This country has been created eliminating indigenous people. The project of Peru and Peruvianness is to eliminate indigeneity. So it will not change. For that reason, I think a new constitution will not change definitely, but we need reforms, we need change in order to create a better future for indigenous people and all Peruvians. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's one lovely, Hermione. Leo.
So one phrase that comes to mind by the Peruvian anthropologist, writer and intellectual Marisol de la Cadena, right, about the Peruvian state and its project, right, was yes to Incas and no to Indians, right? So Incas see Indians no, right? This sort of idea that we'll celebrate Machu Picchu and we'll celebrate a convenient past, right, of indigenous people because it's good for tourism, because it's good for nationalism, because, you know, so on and so forth, because it's bragging rights in the international, but we don't actually want to address or empower or, you know, demarginalize the current indigenous populations and take seriously the kinds of demands that people are making. I am not sure the way out of an impasse, but certainly since the political parties and the established politicians have so, particularly now that so many people have been killed, right, that it's going to be hard to create the kind of trust, right, that dialogue can lead to then changes. So one thing perhaps that could help, and I know that there's been some talk of this, I don't know what the current state of it is maybe the presidents of neighboring countries like, you know, Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil, right, Mexico, who have either left-leaning or populist presidents who have been critical of the state's actions. Maybe people like that coming in and being part of the guarantors, right, of some kind of resolution could be a way to hold then the politicians and the political parties to fulfill some of their promises that are made, right? Because they're sort of a force outside of the Peruvian circle. The other could be certainly the U.S. Should certainly, and I know that there's a bill in Congress, U.S. Congress about this. The U.S. Congress, as it can, should be suspending all military and security aid and exchanges because of the human rights abuses, right? So the killing of civilians who are unarmed, who are participating in protests by the national police in Peru is the kind of thing that should trigger, right, the suspension of that. And of course, the Biden administration, the Obama administration before them have never been particularly supportive of trying to stop coups. That happened in Paraguay, that happened in Honduras, happened in Haiti under President Clinton as well. You know, so I don't have a lot of hope from the presidency, right, the White House in the United States, but maybe those elements within the Congress that are pushing this forward, so people could write to their congressional representatives, right, those people who have connections to these other Latin American nations, or just write to the embassy, right, contact the embassies in these nations and say how you'd like, you know, you feel that they should, as a friend of Peru, intervene to try to support dialogue. Those could be things that happen on a more individual, institutional basis. I know over the years, you know, Sandy and other people, you know, certainly at Connecticut College, we've done some work to build links to coalitions of communities that are organized around particular issues, right? Whether that be global warming or other things that are also affecting us, right, in Connecticut. And we want to try to learn what are communities doing to solve these problems, because we wait for the central government, we're toast, you know, in Connecticut too. And so, you know, finding those ways that you can build connections to, even if it's just having a speaker, even if it's doing a fundraiser, even, you know, sometimes it just gives you great heart to know that other people are listening, right? And folks will have ideas, right? Again, we're in it for the long haul. So we're going to have to think about how do we sustain each other, right, through these links of solidarity and so forth. So I'd say, you know, those are the things, something even that seems little, but if you can sustain it over a decade, your institution or your church or your place of education, your place of work, your union, right, together with, you know, some other social movement or, you know, a coalition, that can make a big difference. And so I wouldn't feel that we shouldn't feel powerless.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to give some opportunities of people asking of different organizations. I would say, you know, Yermani, absolutely. There's a certain floor of like when you're completely erased and actively being eliminated by the state, you need some form of representation and some formalization of recognition, it's not the answer. And I do have much more faith in building coalitions and solidarities, and to engage in even indigenous organizations that have an actual commitment, like a tangible and material commitment to building globally and internationally. Like the Red Nation has been very supportive of this. This organization of the United American Indians of New England, people that have really demonstrated a commitment to that, not just in words, but in actually the deeds and the events that they do is really important. And I think states understand that collaboration, solidarity, and coalition is threatening. I mean, they already banned Evo Morales from going into Peru. And so I think it would be wonderful if there's heads of state and other people to show up, but I feel like it's always been threatening for those of us who, whatever community, I was going to say marginalized, indigenous or Black communities, whatever, to come together is always seen. But I think any kind of solidarity is viewed as threatening. So I definitely encourage everyone to seek out those kinds of opportunities, of which there will be one in Hartford, Connecticut tomorrow. Maybe we'll bring Azucena on, Mataway, if that would be possible, to just have her talk about a rally that's planned in Hartford, Connecticut tomorrow at noon at the Peruvian consulate. She's going to tell us a little bit more about that, and then we can open up for questions. As we're getting Azucena on, I just want to apologize up front. I can maybe squeeze out a little bit past 8:30, but I have another commitment, so I might have to log off. But certainly hope people continue the conversation as long as they can, and that you're able to do so. Are we able to get Azucena on?
Jean-Luc, she said she is on, if you can look, please.
Oh,
We've been trying to find her, so I mean, she's on. We've been just
she's
trying
out
to
there
find her to
somewhere.
be able to put her on the screen. So,
Azucena, could you raise your hand
yeah,
that I can promote you to panelist, please?
And there's some really great questions, and I'm looking now as we're waiting. Lots about, there was one question about the Quechua, the Peruvian diaspora, of which Azucena and I both are a part of. So perfect.
Good evening, siblings. Sayin Tuta, Anyay Turaikuna. Thank you, Anyay, Native American Indians of New England, and the also North American Indian Center of Boston. Nyohaha Ponungspa, Hinayata Huangangspa, Wilika Alpawan Winakushani, Nyoha Ketrochanka Warmikani, Azucena Mina Yantoy Suti. I'm connecting with you all from the ancestral lands of the Podangs and the Wangangs, and I'm a Quechua woman. My name is Azucena Mina Yantoy. And in Peru, as has been stated, there is an ongoing installation of military dictatorship backed by the United States that needs to be held accountable for state-sanctioned violence and massacres of 70 plus of our indigenous people. And there is an intergenerational 500-year struggle, right, that predates all Criollo white settler republics standing on stolen land, because we as indigenous peoples have been historically excluded. And this exclusion is upheld by structural anti-indigenous racism. The people do not want the land, their land, nor their bodies to be exploited by transnational corporations, which is why the people are demanding a new constitution by Constituent Assembly, cancellation of contract laws, which are due to be renewed this year, and justice for the victims, of course, the solution of Congress and resignation of Dina Boluarte. So for tomorrow, if you can please, if anybody is able, join us to denounce the indigenous genocide in Peru at noon at the Peruvian Consulate in Hartford. And that is 19 High Street, Hartford, Connecticut.
Yay, Azucena, and I just want to shout out to her. And she's been doing so much work, excellent work, to just kind of draw attention, to help stage this rally. It's going to rain, but we don't care. We're going to be there. Please come out. And the other thing I would add before we open up to questions is, like, sometimes it's hard for people to think that this is going to impact them, or this is, but, for me, one of the real levers that we can press here, especially those of us that are away, is on the kinds of forces that impact indigenous peoples around the world. which is the attack on resources, primarily through, if not settler and or colonial states, then through global national corporations. And you might think, this is something removed. I mean, indigenous peoples are on the front lines of these movements and the protectors of those lands and resources. But even like right here in Connecticut, where it's supposedly one of the richest states, or if not the richest state in the US right now, highest inequality, everybody's struggling now to pay electric bills. So we need to think, oh, there's a failed state. They don't know when they're going to get electric. There's like skyrocketing electric bills right now. At the same time, Eversource is reporting record profits in excess of $1.4 billion last year. So this is something that it's not the same thing that's happening in Peru, but none of us increasingly are going to be able to protect ourselves from like the greed and profiteering from these same corporations. So you've got to come out and like, I think, stand with us and we'll stand with you. And that's how it begins. So I don't know who's going to monitor the questions, but it seems like there's quite a few.
So, Raquel, are you able to kind of call out some of the questions? Can we pass the word to you? Okay.
There we go. Sorry about that. I want to thank our panelists for such an amazing discussion tonight. You guys have generated the most amount of questions out of all of our panels that we have held in the Indigenous Liberation Speaker Series. So there's that record. I also want to recognize that some folks have asked about accountability and belief in a new constitution. And I know you already addressed that a little bit. And there was another question about the genocide bill. So thank you for getting a little bit into that. I'm wondering, given time, if there are additional resources that you can provide that we can share with folks who have attended tonight, and on our website where we're going to be posting the recording, so that folks can learn a little bit more about what you've talked about. And of course, if there are resources on further ways to engage, because there have been quite a few questions on how to stay connected to the information and where to find information on how to support direct action. So again, since we're short on time, Sandy, if there are any answers that you can speak to just about how folks can stay on top of the situation, and how organizations and people can directly support the frontline communities.
Sandy, you're muted.
We would love for people to support. As Hussein is going to put a link into an organization that Your Money is involved with, that we would love for people to donate and support. I would encourage people to support to Red Nation Media. It's there. It's right there in the chat. Quechua Tinqui. Please support them. Please support the Red Nation and the Red Nation and the Red Media. They've been super supportive of the movement, and they definitely cover global Indigenous issues. Kashaway News is another organization that you can follow to get some reporting, because you're not going to get it on CBS Evening News. So you're going to have to find sources, on social media or alternative news channels. I don't know if Your Money or Leo, you all have some things to add to that list, but we can certainly create a resources that you can put on the website. And somebody, are we meeting at 10 Prospect Street? That's the address on the original poster. No, that was the Yukon. We're just going to meet at the consulate. Is that right, Azucena? Yes, just meet at the consulate. For those that can come to Hartford. Oh, there's a beautiful poster.
Thank you for posting the flyer. There was a question and some discussion on barriers to political participation that Indigenous communities face. And I'm wondering if either any of our panelists can speak a little bit more about that.
I mean, I think one of the things that we see not only in Peru, we've seen like in Mexico as well, right? Is political parties roll into town when they want votes and they make promises, right? And then afterward, they're not around and are not accountable. So I think that that's one issue, you know, in Peru. So one thing that some communities have done, and this is very much inspired and pushed forward by the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico and Chiapas, is demanding on local community autonomy, right? So that you don't have candidates for the established political parties running for local level government and so forth, right? That people run on their own merits by, you know, what their neighbors know and kind of work in that way. So maybe some kind of local or community autonomy could be something that that could be useful. But in general, the other thing that political parties do, you know, they used to be very much male-centered and so forth in the 70s, the 80s, and into the 90s. And Alberto Fujimori, one of the things he did to try to, you know, as a populist authoritarian president, to try to broaden his base, was to bring more women into the political system that he was hoping that would vote for him and support him. So there was an insistence that political parties have a certain number of women in the slots that are listed for their running. So there are mechanisms that the Peruvian political system, even if it's not completely changed, could include more people, right? And Indigenous people in particular. But again, it depends on whether you have faith and whether that system can work. Even to elections, right? What's going to stop us from just having the same array of political candidates who have run over and over again from the same parties coming forward, right? So it's that's a really good question. I don't know. Those are a couple of
Yes, Leo, there are very good questions and comments. I would like to comment something about, for example, yes, regional parties. And of course, the political party who brought Pedro Castillo to the power is a regional party, and the leader of that political party is very close to go to the prison, who is Vladimir Cerrón. But like this political party, left-wing political party, most of political parties in Peru are involved in corruption. Yes, but when I say for the future, maybe Indigenous people could have an Indigenous movement or Indigenous party, I mean that in the history of these regional parties, limeño parties, Indigenous people didn't have a strong presence. Also, they didn't have considered as part of these parties. I mean that as Indigenous people, we need to be part of the construction what is Peru. That is the most important thing for the future in Peru. And I feel that the traditional parties, of course, there are like Partido Acción Popular, Partido Popular Cristiano, Partido Aprista Peruano. In order to survive them, they need to understand that in Peru, there is still the presence of Indigenous people, not only people, Indigenous languages, Indigenous knowledge, and the need in Indigenous people to be part of that power in Peru, and the need from Indigenous people to be considered as people who live long before the creation of Peru, as people who have knowledge to contribute to the country, as people who have languages and they need to use every day in official ceremonies, in the official system of education, in the economy of Peru, for example. In that way, I mean that Indigenous people, if Peru would like to create in the future a country without these kind of problems, Peru and the power in Peru need to understand that the Indigenous people need to be part of Peru. In that way, also there is another comment, but regions and like Cusco, Apurímac, where mostly Indigenous people live, they receive a lot of resources. Yes, of course, I know that. Before starting my PhD program, I worked for many years in local governments. definitely, I agree that they are receiving more and more budget from the central political power in Peru, from Lima, but it doesn't change the participation of regions and indigenous people in what is the construction of Peru. It doesn't change the ongoing colonization to indigenous people. What is the ongoing colonization of indigenous people? As I mentioned, Peru doesn't consider their knowledge. Peru doesn't consider their languages. Peru doesn't consider them as citizens, as Lima people citizens, for example. As I mentioned, we are the second generation of indigenous people who has the Peruvian ID. Our grandparents didn't have the Peruvian citizenship. They were the property of hacendados. So in that context, I mean that in the future, if Peru would like to avoid this kind of crisis, we need to consider the presence of indigenous people at the different levels of the government.
Thank you all. We're going to leave it with Germani with that final thought. I wanted to just remark very briefly about how this has been such a wide sweeping, geographically even, conversation. We've seen Bolivia in the chat. Of course, we have definitely we have Peru. Of course, we have our folks from Turtle Island here listening tonight. I also wanted to thank, especially for our folks in Mexico, Jennifer. I know that our translator is there, Jennifer. Mayra, I believe you're here local in Turtle Island. So, but I definitely want to give muchísimas gracias for the translators, for all of their effort, for all of their work and their heart that they have given tonight. Also, I wanted to give well, first, also the panelists, Azucena, for Sandy, who had to leave earlier, for Leo, for Germani. Thank you so much for your life and for your work and for your hearts that you've shared so graciously here tonight. And then finally, of course, for all of you that are able to make it to the action in Hartford at the Peruvian consulate, please do. If you want, please also add the name of North American Indian Center of Boston as a sponsor for the action, because we're very much in solidarity with our brothers and our sisters and all of our siblings in Peru right now. And then finally, I wanted to also give a nod to our Massachusetts Indigenous Legislative Agenda. We are working on a slate of 5 bills within the State House of Massachusetts. And I think it's a very apropos after this very political discussion to talk about, how much we need systemic change. Right now in our State House, we don't have Indigenous representation. And we're actually working on bills that are kind of just the bare minimum. Please do not be racist in Massachusetts. Ban the native mascots. Honor Indigenous Peoples Day. Celebrate and teach Native American cultures and histories in public school classrooms. Support the education of American Indian and Alaska Native youth to make sure that all of our youth that are facing suicide rates 2 times that of their white peers, that they're able to graduate from school healthy, safe, and alive. And of course, for our ancestors that are held hostage in these institutions, that they're able to go back home. We are hoping to refine the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act on the state level through the Protect Native American Heritage. And of course, that ban racist mascots, that with the so-called big game and the Kansas City team that played, you saw the shot of the so-called fans doing the tomahawk chop in Germany, and just think about all of the international decisions that get made by these people that are doing these chants in these German beer halls, right? And thinking about, you know, just the respect for indigenous peoples. You know, it all kind of comes back to some of these core issues of please do not be racist to us. So again, as I said in the beginning, our fight is won, and we're very honored to have this discussion tonight. So thank you all. And Matoin, do you have any final words?
No, thank you to everyone, and have a good night. Please make sure to keep up with the struggle in Peru, and also anywhere that you see an action, plan to join the action. If you live in a community that has people from the Quechua diaspora, reach out to them, see what you can do to support. You know, we want to follow their leadership, obviously, you know, and see how we can support them in any possible way. So please continue to do that, and also donate to indigenous people who are on the ground in Peru right now.